Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Mauser model of 1891, most famously of Argentina. Common in collectors' circles, this is nonetheless an important milestone in the development of the Mauser series of rifles, and one that we've sadly overlooked too long, so let's correct that by placing this in the lightbox. With an overall length just beyond 48 1/2 inch and weighing in at 8.8 pounds, this is of course an old world magazine repeating, small bore, smokeless powder rifle, a very early one as a matter of fact. It feeds 5 rounds of 7.65 Belgian Mauser into its single stack fixed magazine with the help of a stripper clip. Now, as always, I should remind you all that today's episode is made possible almost exclusively by viewers like yourself, so please consider joining us on Patreon or Player and making the magic happen. Additional support in the literal preservation of firearms history comes from Ballistol, the do-all gun oil that has served for well over a century without harming your beloved collectibles. We've been tracing the history of this particular green and red can all the way through the Second World War, following which, you might not be surprised to hear, Germany wasn't doing so well. F.W. Clever Chemical, makers of Ballistol, had been ravaged as well, reduced to only one remaining plant, a subsidiary located in Leverkusen. Just like after the Great War, Ballistol became a bit of a panacea after the Second, used for both maintenance of firearms and machinery, and, in the form of Neo-Ballistol, as an antimicrobial and healing oil. I've even seen references to it being used as a leather book preservative, effective against book lice and silverfish. For our purposes, however, we only care about its use on guns. Still at that time, the undisputed best for protection that never hardens or gums up. By all means, try them out and let them know that we sent you. Now, today's rifle is both a key part of the Mauser rifle's evolution and a point of pride for its nation of origin, Argentina, who had declared emancipation from Spain in 1810. Their War of Independence would last through 1824. Unfortunately, internal political divisions lasted even longer, resulting in a state of turmoil or even outright civil war that lasted into the 1880s. Externally, Argentina's repeated adversary was Chile. The disputes were almost exclusively about the border between these two nations. It had long ago been negotiated as the peaks of the Andes. However, in actually setting the stakes, the details became a little bit blurry. In short, Argentina wanted a line drawn literally from peak to peak, as this was what was implied in the original paperwork. Chile felt that it was better marked along the ridge line of the mountains, defined by where waters were forced to either flow to the east or to the west. A series of shaky treaties kept this pot from completely boiling over. During the early 1880s, however, this was proving kinda difficult. Argentina's conquest of the desert, a campaign to annex eastern Patagonia, riled the Chileans enough to come to some blows, but no outright war. That's because during this same period, Chile was busy winning the War of the Pacific against both Peru and Bolivia. They did not want to open another front against Argentina. Now, at that time, both Chile and Argentina were fielding armies based on the French doctrine of war, and both were armed with single-shot black powder breech-loading firearms. The Chileans mostly with the Comblane, and the Argentines mostly with the rolling block. Chile's success in the War of the Pacific put the country further onto a martial footing, and it was now quite profitable to expend significant percentages of their GDP on military expansion, especially naval. As part of this effort, Chile sought out better training. Having seen the dramatic conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War, Chilean officials decided to try on the German school of warfare, and in 1885 hired their own German Captain Emil Korner to retrain their armed forces. By the early 1890s, Chile would have a professional army with some 40,000 available troops, properly equipped and ready. By comparison, Argentina only had 6,500 or so, poorly equipped and armed men who were more of a threat to their officers than the enemy. Many of these were literally drawn from prisons. Argentina would have to catch up quickly. Their solution would also conveniently come from Germany, who had merged the interests of the state and commercial industry, pursuing a world-dominating policy. The plan was actually kind of simple. Sell German training and doctrine, and thereby you sell German equipment. No one wants to be at war with their arms dealer. Plus, you build up a lot of influence while still getting paid. This whole thing works even better when you convert one customer into two. Simply get a country to bite, and then find their nearest unfriendly neighbor and show them what their adversary has just bought. Boom, buying frenzy on both sides. Now, so far Chile had focused on artillery and warships. These purchases were more than enough to spook Argentina into action, and so, while Krupp was selling cannon in the region, they also made contracts with Argentine officials, who eventually requested Krupp's opinion on the matter of small arms, who forwarded the Argentine government to Paul Mauser. We've covered this inventor before, but just to be clear, this was the man behind the single-shot, breech-loading black powder rifle adopted by Germany in 1871. This soon gave way to a Kropatschek magazined repeater, the 7184, and eventually the Ottoman 1887, a smallish-bore black powder repeater. That same year, by the way, 1887, the Argentine government began attempting to acquire Mauser repeating rifles. Their initial request was for 15,000 of the then current model, the 7184, though they wanted it chambered for their own 11mm cartridge as used in the existing Remington rolling block. Now, you and I know that 1887 was a particularly poor year to try and adopt a repeating rifle in black powder. That's because even as the magazine rifle was catching on, along with early small bore cartridges and rapid reloading technologies, France managed to up the ante. They released the Lebel, essentially a buffed-up Gras action and Kropatschek magazine, but crucially, chambering the 8mm smokeless cartridge, which was screaming fast, flat shooting without a great plume of smoke, and incomparably cleaner on the bore. You could shoot much further, more accurately, with less sight adjustment, and with a fraction of the fouling per shot. It was a revolution, and it hit just as many countries were considering catching up to just plain repeating rifles, magazine rifles. Even so, Argentina wanted to keep using their existing cartridge and pressed that their request be considered. There would of course be people that told them no, and the first was their own military attaché in France, Pablo Riccieri. Born August 8, 1859 in San Lorenzo, Pablo's father had been an Italian seaman. In 1874, young Pablo volunteered for Santa Fe's militia, then fighting a rebellion led by General Bartolomé Mitre. Riccieri was then accepted into the military academy in Buenos Aires, where he specialized in artillery, graduating in 1879 as a second lieutenant. From here, he fought under General Roca in the battles of Puente Alsina, Los Carrés, and Barracas. In 1881, he was sent to the École Supérieure de Guerre in Liège, Belgium, further studying military engineering. He graduated second in his class in 1886 and was promoted to the rank of captain. In early 1887, he had the fortune of befriending Julio Argentino Roca. At this time, Roca had just completed his first term as Argentina's president. Traveling to Paris, he had fallen ill and become a friend and mentor to Riccieri during his recovery. When the request came through to seek out the Mauser 1871-84 in a large black powder cartridge, Riccieri immediately wrote back that this was an obsolete design. Still, the government spoke to Paul Mauser, who was at first excited given the fact that the 7184 was already in production and there were likely surplus rifles and parts, enough for a small contract anyway. But when he found out about the special chambering, he declined. The changes necessary would mean too much retooling on what was going to be an abandoned product. Still, the Argentine government pushed, and they took the matter over Mauser's head to his parent company, Ludwig Loewe. Born in 1837, son of a Jewish community teacher, Ludwig had operated a small machine tool shop in Berlin in the 1860s. He became interested in US mass production technology, visiting the States in 1870 and setting up a company of his own in Germany on his return. With his investors, Ludwig began licensing and producing sewing machines in large numbers. Unfortunately, an 1873 economic crisis all but halted consumer spending. This forced Loewe to scramble for any sort of manufacturing jobs that he could secure to keep his factory open. With the German adoption of the Mauser 1871 rifle, there was a massive demand for metalwork on everything from sling swivels to receivers, in a rush to rearm the entire armed forces of Germany. Loewe managed to secure contracts for various small parts before eventually expanding into the production of entire rifles and even ammunition. Ludwig Loewe the man, however, would pass away unexpectedly in 1886, succeeded by his brother Isidor, who did not change the name of the company. It remained Ludwig Loewe. Brother Isidor was perhaps an even better businessman. Seeking to dominate the arms industry, he went straight to the source. Paul Mauser, who, seeking to produce the Ottoman 1887 rifle in his own factory, secured funds via a German bank. Unfortunately, Mauser had only held 1/3 ownership of his own company, with the bank holding the rest. Loewe managed to secure these stocks, thereby seizing control of Waffenfabrik Mauser. Loewe then went on to acquire other firms, particularly ammunition plants and even controlling interest in Belgium's Fabrique Nationale, making Loewe a European small arms powerhouse. Reaching out to Loewe, Argentina now offered to purchase 30,000 Mauser 1871-84s in 11mm Remington. This started a series of negotiations that soon fell flat when the German government placed orders for 425,000 new rifles. These were, of course, their own smokeless, small-bore, the secretive commission rifle of 1888. The task of ordering rifles for Argentina was then transferred to Minister José Paz, who would in turn come to rely on Riccieri for his expertise. Another attempt was made to order the 11mm cartridge rifles, now 50,000 of them, and 10,000 carbines, but even this was of no interest to Loewe. Everyone was changing over to small bore. Such a small contract wouldn't be worth the extra overhead. Alright, if you can't beat them, join them. Since Loewe is so preoccupied with this German commission rifle, let's just buy those. Unfortunately, at that time, Germany considered the model of 1888 to be a military secret, although everyone seemed to know about it. But long story short, you can't buy one, at least not yet. So scram. This momentary frustration was probably for the best, as we know in hindsight that the 1888 wasn't really the best of its era. Attempting to sift around for other rifles, Minister Paz eventually pulled in our friend Riccieri, who, by the way, had not been idle. He had joined the Argentine mission in Berlin, met with von Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm II, attaching himself to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and participating in the German army training maneuvers. He was even awarded the Commander's Cross of the Military Order of Albert of Saxony in recognition for his contributions. At home, he was promoted to the rank of Major. Suffice it to say, Riccieri was becoming Argentina's default expert on martial modernization. Riccieri began surveying the field for acceptable rifle designs, eventually becoming curious about several models put forward by Leon Nagant of Belgium. In time, Nagant would even travel to Argentina, but the demonstrations of his rifles went miserably, and likewise in Europe, the same rifles were passed over by the Belgian Commission. They instead opted for Paul Mauser's response to the Gewehr 1888, the Mauser 1889, a fantastic step forward and perhaps the first rifle to set the standard for the smokeless repeater. We've covered this firearm in detail, but it's most notable for being the first to use the rapid loading stripper clip, a solid alternative to the Mannlicher end block. Other benefits included symmetrical front locking lugs, a one-piece bolt body, 5-round vertical magazine, and the barrel jacket. This kept the shooter's hands cool and provided for thermal expansion of the barrel, which kept the rifle more precise despite repeated firing. It was bored for a jacketed 7.65mm bullet. This was Mauser's first smokeless cartridge. Small bore, rimless, and completely modern. All of these features and more led to the Belgian adoption, and Riccieri, having been a student in Liège, had excellent contacts in their rifle commission. Over the course of selection, he would end up receiving detailed technical data from the Belgians, and then later the Ottomans, and even the secretive Germans. He favored the Belgians' reasoning and also pushed for Argentina to adopt this new Mauser rifle, though he did face brief opposition from one General Joaquin Villobueno, who was favoring the British school of thought, which had developed the Lee Metford Mark I rifle. This was only a brief struggle, as Riccieri pointed out that the Belgian Mauser was lighter, front-locking, used a rimless cartridge, a fixed magazine of greater strength, sported a lovely barrel jacket, and that Argentina had access to the technical data on materials used, much more so than with the British rifle, so the Mauser's quality was guaranteed. Finally, the Lee design was being offered at a cost of around 172 francs, whereas the Mauser was just 81.50. Fun fact, in demonstrating his rifle to the Argentinians in France, Paul Mauser traveled under a false name, Nicholas Dressel, as he feared the French would intervene and deny his entry. Ultimately, the Mauser 1889 was selected, although Waffenfabrik Mauser was busy with a massive Ottoman rifle contract, one that stipulated that they could take on no other sales until it was completed, so the Argentine government signed with Ludwig Loewe in February of 1890. They wanted 100,000 rifles and 20,000 carbines on the Belgian 1889 pattern. Small problem with that, there was no Belgian carbine yet. We'll cover the details on that story in our next episode though. The rifles were priced at 81.50 franc, as I said before. This included a Belgian-style bayonet and other accessories. The total cost of the whole contract was 9,650,000 franc. A down payment of 2,500,000 was required. One of the most interesting clauses of this initial contract placed a 1 million franc guarantee that Loewe would not sell to other South American countries until at least 2/3 of the contract had been completed. Since Mauser would be busy with the Ottomans for a long time to come, Chile was effectively locked out of German rifle production. Bold move. Now, most of you probably know this rifle is not a direct clone of the Mauser 1889, so this original contract wasn't fulfilled as it was written. Instead, while awaiting both money and technical specifications from the Argentinians, a number of improvements were made to the Mauser design. Many of these can be seen in the Ottoman model of 1890, a rifle that we've actually covered in detail before. This was made possible by a clause in the Ottoman contract which permitted them to shift their production to the latest Mauser design at any time. Adapting the Belgian 1889, the Ottomans had elected to forego the barrel jacket, which proved too fragile in service and also had a habit of trapping moisture against the barrel. Ditching the jacket, however, left them to deal with the problem of allowing for heat expansion of the barrel. Mauser solved this by ditching the tapered barrel and adopting one that reduced in diameter in distinct steps. These focused the expansion at key points, which could be relieved in the stock, allowing room for expansion, while otherwise bedding the majority of the barrel. Other improvements included attaching the rear sight via a full ring all the way around the barrel instead of just soldering it on. The rear sight slider used a locking button instead of a friction fit. The sear was now a one-piece construction, and the threads attaching the bolt sleeve to the cocking shroud were now buttressed for additional strength. The Argentine contract stalled throughout 1890. Yes, some of it was reviewing the upgrades adopted by the other powers, but other delays were more dramatic. At one point, Riccieri had returned to Buenos Aires just in time for a minor revolution. Lasting just a few days, the uprising and its extreme suppression ruined the image of the government and forced President Jarez Kelman to resign. All the while, a series of prototypes were carried back and forth, each with minor changes. Riccieri's rank continued to grow. In September of 1890, he was appointed president of the Technical Arms Commission and advanced to lieutenant colonel. In this role, he had to assemble a proper rifle commission, one that could actually oversee and inspect production at Loewe. In 1891, his team reviewed the available prototypes and came to two conclusions. The first we covered, a final decision to take on the Ottoman jacketless barrel. The second was the introduction of a locking screw for the magazine, which they felt could be released too easily. However, Loewe had already begun magazine production, as it was one of the non-disputed parts, at least they thought so up until this point. This change wouldn't be made, therefore, in the first contract rifles. The barrels, however, had not been entirely decided. It would take until September of 1891 for the Argentine Commission to select Krupp Marcati steel for their construction. This was superior to the German Gewehr 88 or the Belgian 1889, but also more costly. And on that topic, Riccieri had been ordered to stall the contract however he could. That's because Argentina was facing a financial crisis for the current fiscal year. The constant changes and now stalling, however, infuriated Loewe. He eventually threatened to declare the contract in default and seek arbitration for damages. In this scenario, Argentina would be the clear loser, as they had repeatedly missed deadlines stipulated in the paperwork. Riccieri, however, managed to calm things down and pointed out that Loewe would make much more money by being patient, as the final hurdle was just a matter of waiting for the next budget to be released. In October, they managed to agree verbally on a contract for 25,000 rifles with an option to extend to 60,000. Then, following this, another 60,000, thereby hitting the original 120,000. This was not finalized, but Loewe felt comfortable and started production anyway. What was undecided at that very moment was pricing. Ditching the barrel jacket and other changes caused a reduction in cost. However, that Krupp Marcotti steel and retooling for those extras added expenses. Overall, however, Riccieri and his team managed to negotiate the prices down from the original contract even after all this shenanigans. The rifles went from 81.50 to 73 francs 25 centimes, though part of this savings was from having dropped the bayonets from the contracts. These were later sourced directly for just 6 francs 50. Still a savings. Through November of 1891, the details were finalized. An initial order for 25,000 rifles, then a second order for 25,000 more, plus 10,000 carbines. The cartridge, by the way, was slightly changed from the Belgian. Argentina selected to use German powder, as was found in the Gewehr 1888's 8mm cartridge. They also used a slightly different bullet, making them a scooch faster than the Belgians. 10 million rounds were contracted for with Deutsche Metallpatronenfabrik at 148 francs per 1,000 rounds. Bayonets became a whole other matter. Minister Paz was worried that he needed a hedge against seeming as if Argentina only favored Germany, and attempted to have them constructed in France, evening things up a little bit. However, the bids were almost twice the cost. The arsenal at Saint-Étienne tried to solve this by offering up surplus chassepot bayonets at just 30 centimes a pop. However, Riccieri thankfully intervened, pointing out that the bayonets were, and I quote, better suited for hanging on the walls of museums. They were too thin and too hard to modify for use with the Argentine rifles. Instead, bayonets were acquired from Weyersberg Kirschbaum, who had actually helped adapt the Remington Model 1879 pattern into something more modern. The result was a 38-centimeter blade, the length being insisted on as it was longer than the Chilean Mannlichers. Weight was a strong factor, so the dimensions were carefully minimized. Even so, brass grips were fitted to avoid rot and corrosion. Aluminum was considered, but couldn't be arranged in time. However, subsequent contracts would see it replace the brass. There, it was done. Riccieri and his men had managed to hold on to the contract, reduce the deliveries into smaller chunks, and even get the prices down. They had selected an excellent rifle, perhaps the best available in the world at that very moment. Argentina had gotten the most for the least, and on all of its own terms. So of course, in early 1892, their government panicked and blew a bunch of money on something really stupid. This was largely due to the 1891 Chilean Civil War, which had been resolved by September. During and after this conflict, the Chilean government continued to expand its available armaments, this time including repeating rifles. Locked out of Germany, they had acquired Mannlichers in both 11mm black powder and 8mm, though many of the latter fell into rebel hands. News of these small-bore repeaters in Chile unsettled Argentina, who was already adopting their own but had not yet received any rifles. Rumors flared about a possible Chilean invasion, and panic broke out. In January of 1892, the Argentine government requested that Minister Paz secure delivery of 15,000 rifles within 50 days. Riccieri could only lay hands on German Gewehr 1888s inside of 60 days. These could be had at the same price as the superior model 1891s, though no accessories would be included. Argentina would ultimately contract for 5,000 rifles and 500,000 cartridges. These were the German 8mm cartridge, and this was all against the recommendations of Riccieri. This eventually cost them some 619,750 francs, after they had to buy up the accessories and practice rounds needed as well. Inspecting the rifles was a nightmare, as most were guns that had already been rejected by the Germans. Roughly 35% were rejected on the first day of inspections, though eventually 5,000 usable guns were pieced together and shipped, arriving in just 41 days from the request. The attack, of course, never came, and the rifles were never issued. They were eventually sold to Peru, which was frankly another mess. With that little distraction over, the first 1,100 Mausers were completed during June of 1892 and shipped to Buenos Aires. These were kept in storage until enough could be amassed for general training and issue. On December 16, 1892, the Argentine Congress finally officially declared this the model of 1891 Mauser as their weapon of war, which actually also prohibited it from being sold to civilians. Now, my rifle here isn't exactly the first pattern gun, but between it and some other samples that I have on hand, I think we can show you what they had adopted. We of course have a very long rifle going all the way to the rear. We have a straight wrist stock, lower sling swivel, and steel butt plate with a inlet up at the top, very strong. Back to the action, and for those of you who are familiar with Mausers, this won't seem too terribly alien. We have an external box magazine, single stack, 5 rounds vertical, and on top, well, we'll need to change our focus. Looking up top, we have our flag safety, our cocking piece, cocking shroud. Yep, this is a Mauser, this being an early smokeless Mauser. Not as early as the 1889 or 1890 Ottoman, but we're doing all right. Now, we don't have any sort of extra flappies on the side of the bolt yet. Hint, hint, something's coming in the future. And we do have a 90-degree rotating front locking bolt. In order to remove this from the firearm, we simply pull on this guy here and pull this all the way out of the gun. By the way, while we're talking about the bolt release, it also provides stability to our stripper clip, which doesn't have any pips, and there's no notch in that receiver. So this is retained once inserted by a flap coming off of the bolt release. So if I just push this slightly to the left and then drop it in, we'll feed our 5 rounds should we have them. We could bolt forward, kicking this out of the way, and then we're in business. So let me go ahead and use that bolt release to go ahead and get the bolt out. And let's get a better look at this magazine. Just like the Belgian 89, there's a stack of springs and levers in here, which we'll see better in our animation, this being the hinge point of the whole thing. It's hard to make out, but there is a little release lever, or button rather, here. Just so you guys can make it out, it's right there, and it's designed to be pressed by the tip of a bullet, although usually a full metal jacket. Just push, and well, make sure you push enough. There we go, and pull. Beautiful. Now, we can take this further apart by removing the screw, but that's really not part of the standard takedown, and we'll be able to see the internals from our animation. This particular release system would soon be found to be a little bit too easy, and so it wouldn't stick around. If I could get this realigned, that would be really lovely, wouldn't it? Boonk, and right back in. Now, the original bolts for these rifles had the extractor set dead over top. This did not stick around as a feature. It would later be replaced with an extractor set slightly to the right-hand side. This bolt is actually out of my Ottoman 1890, which would have been identical at the very start of this production. Now, the reason for that change we'll see in a moment, but it's no surprise that it's going to have to do with improving extraction. Just so you can see it more clearly, this would have been the original configuration. This is the modified. The extractor is set over to the right, and our locking lug has actually been recessed somewhat. Again, more on that as we get into this episode. The original rear sight, which I'm borrowing off of another loaner firearm because mine was updated, was modeled off the 1871-84 with a right side release only that hangs pretty low, and of course it's a flip-up ladder. You would put it up like this in order to use it. That makes it a bit hard for you guys to read at home. I'll put it back down. So we can push our button and adjust all the way up to, well actually if we read off the top, we get 2,000 meters. The 0 here is for 250, although there is a flip-up battle sight for 350 as well on a big old hinge at the rear. Very German. Like the Ottomans, they opted for a very short upper handguard, and yet they decided to reinforce it. Instead of relying on spring clips, this uses, well, copper wire set in grooves wrapped around the barrel and then fitting into inlets in the stock. The lower barrel band is retained by a simple spring and of course has the sling swivel. And as we come forward, we have a very simple front cap. We have a bayonet lug and a reduced diameter barrel in order to fit that cross piece for the bayonet. Then we have a cleaning rod with a brass tip, and our front sight is pressed on and driftable for windage. Not on the fly, mind you, but at an armorer level. At the front of this guy, we can see that the front plate is retained by 2 screws. And you can probably just barely make out the Argentine crest on this gun. It would have been present on all originally. They tend to be either worn out or covered over by re-arsenaling, re-bluing, or, frankly, many were ground off intentionally, but we'll cover that later on. Now, I'm going to go straight into our animation, but I warn you, some minor improvements will be visible. We'll cover those a bit further into the episode.
Overall, this is going to seem very familiar to anyone who's watched our Mauser 1889 and 1890 episodes. First, we'll load 5 rounds of 7.65mm Mauser from a flat-sided stripper clip into the magazine. The core feature of this action is the single-piece bolt body, which sports a pair of locking lugs, presently set horizontally at its front. Pressing the bolt body forward strips the first round from the magazine and presses it into the chamber. Dropping the bolt handle turns the lugs into the locking recesses in the receiver, sealing the breech for firing. Inside the bolt body is the firing pin, which is constantly pressed forward by a powerful coil spring. The cocking piece is threaded onto the firing pin and prevents it from traveling forward until, of course, we pull the trigger. When the bolt handle is raised, a diagonal cut at its rear cams the cocking piece slightly rearward. This is just enough to retract the firing pin, thus preventing an accidental discharge on feeding. As we retract the bolt, the cocking piece clears the sear. But on the return stroke, its lower projection snags, holding it rearward until we continue forward. This cocks the firing pin back, a cock-on-close action. The trigger is attached to the sear assembly, the upper projection of which engages the cocking piece. The sear is powered by a coil spring. This not only biases the sear upwards, it also returns the trigger forward. The trigger is 2-stage, thanks to those 2 lumps at its top. These rest against the receiver to create a sort of double hump sensation as you pull. This is the cocking shroud. It both protects the cocking piece and houses the safety flag. Rotating the safety does 2 things. Most importantly, it turns a semicircular blade into the path of the cocking piece, which cams it slightly rearward, and prevents it from being released forwards while the safety is on. At the other end, the safety has a half-moon projection, which turns into a notch on the bolt body. This prevents the bolt from being rotated while the safety is on. Of course, rotating the safety flag back frees the action to work normally. The extractor is simple, frankly, too simple. As we feed the next cartridge, it does not lip under the extractor. Instead, we must press it all the way home so the extractor snaps over the rim. This proved to be a weak arrangement. In particular, a stuck case could too easily defeat the extractor, causing it to snap over the other way. Argentina will later solve this with a pin pressed into the receiver. This keeps pressure on the extractor in the firing position and at the start of rotation. This prevents it from jumping back over the rim due to partial engagement. Otherwise, this works like you'd expect. The extractor claw pulls the spent case into the ejector blade, which shares a spring with the bolt release. The ejector passes through a channel in the left locking lug, striking the rear of the case, chucking it from the action. As for the magazine assembly, it's technically detachable, but that was only for cleaning and servicing. The assembly is, in hindsight, fairly complex. The pivoting arm is both powered by a flat spring underneath and carries another flat spring over top, which in turn powers a hinged follower. All of this presses the rounds upward, readying them to be stripped from the magazine. When the rifle is empty, the follower does not rise past the feed lips, and therefore does not lock the bolt open. Alright, let's go shoot it.
You know, it's actually quite beautiful. If you squinted while watching that, you got a peek at the future. While the first 50,000 rifles were still being delivered, a new contract was signed with Loewe in March of 1893. This time for 55,000 rifles and 5,000 more carbines. While this was being negotiated, Riccieri managed to make some improvements. In no particular order, the cocking piece was strengthened. Its locking tab was increased in size and tapered to prevent stress concentration. I am unsure if available cocking pieces were used up, or if this change might have come slightly later, because I have seen the early style on rifles known to have been produced during the 1893 contract. The previously attempted magazine locking screw was finally added. This made disassembly far more intentional. Less visible, the rear wall of the magazine was also reinforced. The bolt sleeve, previously round, received a set of wings. These helped prevent wobble or rotation, and also provided a measure of eye protection against any gases that might escape a ruptured case and travel down the locking lug raceways to the rear of the gun. The biggest frustration, however, had been the extractor. This problem was so acute that regimental gunsmiths were required to carry 40 replacements in the field and had a dedicated tool just for their replacement. The initial design was a simple claw-shaped spring set over the bolt. This design suffered two major problems. The first was that it was not a controlled feed. You know what? Let me show you what I mean by that. We've got a pair of dummied up cartridges in there, no powder or primer, and let's take a look. In a controlled feed, the moment that cartridge leaves the magazine, it'll be under the control of the bolt and its extractor. Let's see what happens here though. Let's go forward. Well, we're still in the mag. We're still in the mag. Still in the mag, and then, where's that moment? There. We're outside the mag. And yet, it is not under control of the bolt. As a matter of fact, if I push this forward until I hit that spring resistance, still not under control. If I push it all the way forward, bottomed out, and let go, nothing. As a matter of fact, this will not engage until I actually turn the bolt in, at which point you heard that click. It snapped over the rim of the cartridge, and therefore it now has control of the cartridge. Only at that moment does that happen. That's not ideal. An uncontrolled feed can cause a lot of problems. For one thing, if you go ahead and let me put this guy back in here for a moment. If you go ahead and get one as far as this, and then forget and come back and grab another, you're shoving into your own cartridge. Not only is that a bad jam in the sense that you have to know to extract this with your finger, and the more you beat on it, the worse it gets, you can also potentially set off the previous cartridge by going tip to primer and really ramming on this bolt. That was a problem the Germans especially ran into with the Gewehr 88, a huge issue. And I'm sure Argentina had to train around the same problem. Once you have a cartridge all the way forward and this guy goes to snap over, there's that click. Not only have you put some extra flex on your extractor, but you now have to leave enough recess around that bolt face in order to have the extractor click over and be able to rotate, because the extractor is rotating with the bolt. That's a lot of relief around the chamber area. It also means that when we go to unbolt, the extractor has to go around the rim of the cartridge, or perhaps twist the cartridge if you're really lucky, and then it will go ahead and pull this guy out. That extra relief means there's no pressure on the extractor to truly hold against the rim. And if you get a stuck case, it's very likely that the extractor will mostly get sprung back out of the way, and then it might chip a bit popping over it. Repeat that a few times and you've cracked your extractor, which is why they went through so many of them. Overall, an uncontrolled feed is really not a great thing. Now, back in Germany, Mauser would engineer a solution to this problem, the first of which was a sort of detent to encourage the rounds to snap into place. However, this wasn't an entirely controlled feed either, and it weakened the locking lug on that side of the bolt. Argentina didn't want that solution. The Mauser model of 1893, however, introduced a long, strong, and non-rotating extractor that caught the cartridge rim as it left the magazine. However, the Argentine Mausers were too narrow in the receiver to easily implement this solution, making it a very expensive proposition. A simpler solution was found by adjusting the extractor and supporting it. It was moved towards the right locking lug, which was also shortened at its front. This was done to make room for a simple pin that was set into the receiver. The pin kept pressure on the extractor, keeping it from jumping over a stuck case rim as it rotated out of the chamber. The extractor improvement, more so than any of the others, was eventually applied to nearly every single rifle in service, though it took until 1900 or so to get this done. Loewe was obligated to provide the new bolts and provided machinery and training to Argentina to accomplish the conversion. Now, during the production of the 1893 contract rifles, Argentina was once again trying to suck and blow at the same time. The Ministry of War asked Riccieri to hurry up and execute the new contract. The Ministry of Finance, however, wanted him to use stalling tactics so that they could hold off payment. Riccieri had to choose, and this time he didn't stall. This proved, luckily, to be the right decision, as an opportunity soon fell into his lap. You see, Spain was struggling to maintain its empire. After a series of violent incidents in the Rif, 6,000 Riffians, mostly carrying Remington rifles, attacked Melilla. This moved Spain into action and required the issuing of a great many, preferably modern rifles. Thankfully, Spain had just adopted the new and excellent Mauser model of 1893. Unfortunately, these wouldn't be arriving soon enough in large enough numbers for the immediate problems of the Rif. The Spanish Arms Commission approached Mauser, then Loewe, with the hope that already completed rifles of significant quantity could be had in short order. The best candidate on hand might just be those rifles already completed for Argentina. Initially, Spain would request the total on hand, 20,000 rifles. However, they wanted 5,000 immediately. While the offer was still being received and processed through the correct channels, another request for 5,000 more came through Uruguay, which was really just brokering for Spain as well. Skipping the details a bit, Spain ultimately did end up with 10,000 rifles. However, thanks to a cholera outbreak at the port, these were delayed so long that they arrived too late for any fighting. This is just one of those Spanish rifles, which is why it has the magazine and bolt upgrades, but still has an original rear sight. More on that change in a moment. While the 1891s were welcomed in an emergency, Spain had a problem once they introduced their 7mm model of 1893. So the Argentine rifles were gathered up and placed in one colony, Cuba. Apparently they were useful enough that another contract was let for 5,000 carbines in late 1894. These were sent specifically for Cuban service. Thanks to the Spanish-American War and the US gathering up captured arms afterwards, some of these entered the US collector's market, hidden amongst the rolling blocks and 1893s. On the Argentine side of the deal, things worked out nicely. They got to keep their contract, with their rifles being replaced over time, and it delayed their payment. Riccieri also made one other deal for the refitting of the first contract of carbines, but we'll talk about that next time since we're sticking with the rifle today. We gotta finish this. Starting in December of 1893, bolts began failing, mostly around the handle. This was not a problem with the first 90,000 or so rifles, making it a new development. In the end, Loewe would have to replace 40,000 bolts at their own expense. Oof. However, the rifle was still apparently acceptable because in March of 1895, another contract was signed. This time, 30,000 rifles, and once again, further improvements were made. The handguard was lengthened, which helped with bayonet fighting and handling when the barrel was hot. The rear sight markings were made deeper, longer lasting, and easier to read. The cleaning rod tip was changed from brass to a soft steel, as this was less likely to be deformed when the rifle was being handled roughly. And finally, further changes were made to the bolt, slightly bulked up and softening the corners where the handle meets the body, and where the ball meets the shaft. 1895 was also a year of reform for the Argentine army. In its bid to beat Chile, Argentina had focused less on tactics and more on population as a whole. Massive immigration brought both people and talent, as they were particularly targeting educated Europeans. The 1895 census surprised many, as it showed a population over 4 million, with nearly 2 million men of fighting age available. That November, the Argentine Congress passed a law to reform their armed forces. There would be 3 armies, a National Guard of 20,000 men, a standing army of 60,000, and a conscripted army of 975,000. That last one was made possible by the European method of compulsive service for all male citizens at age 20. This lasted only a year, but then put you into reserve to be drawn upon in times of war. This was nice to have because Chile and Argentina were still fighting over their border. Negotiations were, in 1898, actually breaking down once more. It's no surprise then that another contract would follow, though this time it wasn't technically with Ludwig Loewe. That's because thanks to scandals around the Gewehr 1888 and a rise in anti-Semitic feelings towards Loewe, the munitions side of the business was rebranded to Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken. This contract was originally going to be for 60,000 long arms, but it morphed over time. It ultimately became 56,000 rifles and 16,000 carbines, though 5,000 of the rifles and 3,000 of the carbines were to be delivered without stocks. In May of 1900, 2,000 rifles from this contract were ceded to Bolivia, along with 500 carbines. Bolivia, of course, paid for them, but Argentina did not request replacements. Instead, they took payment in the form of just 12 Maxim machine guns. Bolivian 1891s will bear the Bolivian crest, which is helpful for identifying them. Another 16,000 rifles and 4,000 carbines, about half of which were unassembled, were sold to Peru in April of 1901. These two had their crest replaced. All of these rifles would be replaced for Argentina by DWM, but only 2,500 of the carbines. I guess Argentina felt they had enough. Given these were the last of the 1891s provided, that gives us a universal total of 230,400 rifles and 33,500 cavalry carbines overall. This includes some 400 school rifles, which we haven't really covered in detail. Thanks to British mediation and actual demarcation of the borders, the core dispute between Chile and Argentina was resolved in 1905. Over that time, the Mauser 1891 had done its job, deterring a fight between the powers. It was also, thankfully, just modern enough to survive years of rapid arms advancement. So much so that in 1904, Argentina decided to adopt the latest in bullet technology, the Spitzer. Lighter and more pointy, with a boat tail, this wasn't just stable in flight, it also had less surface engagement with the rifling. So, the Spitzer bullets flew fast and flat. This meant less fiddling with the sights for longer point-blank distances, reducing human error. The bullet now only weighed 182 grains and traveled just over 2,700 feet per second. Perhaps because of budget reasons, this cartridge wouldn't actually be introduced until after the adoption of a new rifle. This was, of course, the Mauser 1898 derived Argentine model of 1909, a gun we'll have to cover in detail another day. Introducing the 1909 and 7.65 Spitzer left room to update the old 1891s. They were made with excellent steel barrels, and the new cartridge did not require any changes except to the sights. So, in 1910, their Arms Commission ordered 180,000 new rifle sights and 32,000 for carbines from DWM. While these were received in 1911, it appears that they were not fitted until after the First World War. However, some rifles were fitted with telescopic sights in 1913. These experiments were later passed on to the model of 1909. Despite some domestic production of ammunition, Argentina struggled for the war years as Europe soaked up every bullet that they could get a hold of. By 1917, they had finally depleted all of their round-nosed ammo and decreed that the 1891s be replaced entirely with the 1909s for frontline service. The fact that the 1891 was officially replaced before the Spitzer conversion was begun in earnest likely explains why we see a strange mix of features later on. The new Spitzer rear sight looks like this. Interestingly, it also only goes up to 2,000 meters despite being the same length. We have no battle sight at the rear that flips up. Instead, we just have our fixed 0, and we can adjust by pressing both of the locking tabs and therefore have some extra redundancy in this system. They must have had some breakdowns. Now, that overall length only coming out to 2,000 makes sense when you realize that if you adjust this all the way up and read from this notch, you get your 2,000 meters, whereas previously you read off a notch at the top of the leaf. Not a bad improvement, and certainly a little clearer to read. It's interesting to note that you can find a fair few combinations of features because of the fact that many of these guns were sort of converted to Spitzer. So you may find a gun that has the original rear sight, but has had the 350 meter 0 removed and is just using the 250 for everything out to that same length. And then, frankly, they don't care about the leaf for some reason. Or you may find it with the sliding leaf just taken off the gun entirely and the rear flipper gone so that you just have this one sight to use and can't mess it up. Generally though, you see this pattern, the updated pattern, or maybe the early one. Now post-war, Argentina managed to stock up on ammo, importing from Belgium beginning in 1922. Hooray, the hard times are over. With all this covered, I'd normally go on into more detail on the service life and ultimate surplusing of these rifles. However, I still need to tell you all about the carbines and some Peruvian changes, and maybe why so many crests are missing off of these guns. Fun fact, I don't actually know for sure, but there is an educated guess out there. All that and more can be found on our next episode, but for now, let's go ahead and get Mae's opinion on the Mauser model of 1891 long rifle. All right, once more, we've made room for Mae.
Hello.
And of course, we have an 1891 Argentine Mauser long rifle.
We do.
This is a very big boy.
It is. It's very long.
It almost, I don't know what it is about the 1891s.
Yeah.
I don't think they're as big as they are.
What do you mean? Like you see it online or in a picture
you see
or something?
a picture and it just doesn't feel that big.
Mm-hmm.
And which doesn't make any sense because I've handled the Ottoman 1890. I've handled the 1889.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why the 1891 seems smaller to me.
I don't know how it does either, considering I see this and I think, oh, this is like the Belgian 1889 that we've handled previously. So for me, I wasn't surprised by the length. What surprised me was the weight, because even though it should be visible in pictures, that stepped barrel up there,
Yeah.
I did not anticipate just how much density there is in this guy. It's a lot of weight to it.
That's fair. Okay, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. I hand you this rifle,
Okay.
and what do you think? First thing.
Well, that's literally what I said.
It's very dense.
Yeah. No, but that's the thing is that, so the length, yes, it is definitely up there. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, it's just another long standard Mauser, kind of like, it's probably going to feel and be a lot like our Belgian 1889. Wouldn't be surprised if it had been.
Should be near identical to the Ottoman 1890 that we already shot.
Right. So that's interesting that you say that. I didn't necessarily pick up on that immediately, which I should have the moment that I saw the top of this action, especially with that little bridge assist right there for loading. So yeah, that should have piqued my moment, but it didn't. But then immediately I go, Jesus criminy, why is it that heavy? Why?
Where's the balance point at?
Unfortunately, not that bad. It's right there. Okay, it's right in front of the mag. It's a little forward, but you know what? That's where I rest my left hand anyway.
Okay.
Pretty much. So it's not that terrible. But yeah, so it's got the length, it's got the weight, and I'm thinking, oh boy, it's going to be a long day. Straight wrist. Butt plate didn't feel that bad into my shoulder. It kind of has a nice little curve to it there, so it's not too bad.
It certainly didn't stand out, which is a good thing. You don't want it to.
I think that's the thing I kept thinking throughout the day. So I try to make some notes to myself towards the end of the shoot to kind of be like, okay, this is how I feel about this. This is what I thought about that. And there are some little things to talk about on this guy, but for the most part, I just felt this was very unremarkable.
Yeah, very middle of the road.
Yeah, it doesn't really feel like anything stands out all that amazingly just looking at it. Like nothing really kind of stands, like there's no giant longovizier sight or really awkwardness for charger bridge for the action or anything like that. No, it all kind of seems...
That's kind of a compliment though. If you think about it, the idea is a good rifle should almost not exist to the infantryman. I know that doesn't make sense, but he should be able to take it with him, present it when it's needed in a fight, and then deliver shots on target without having to think too much about the gun. You don't want to have to fiddle and faddle around with it.
Okay.
In that regard, was there anything in terms of being a bolt-action rifle that made the utility of this awkward or unusual, or did it just work?
Well, I mean, for the most part, it did just work just fine. The only thing that it really just kind of gets into the shooting aspect of it was the action was smooth. That was nice. Loading was very nice. Everything about that felt pretty standard and straightforward. The only thing that felt kind of weird was the trigger on this guy. It didn't quite settle well with me. I remember thinking, pulling through the first stage, and at one point it caught, and I went, oh, okay, it's already here at the second stage. And then I pulled through that and went, no, that wasn't it yet. Okay, well, maybe it's going to... No, I'm not there yet. But then eventually you get to the obvious cliff, like you can see it in the video right there. And then it still didn't really feel like that was it. For some reason, it still felt like there was more, like the second stage was more of a pull through than I expected. And then bam, it goes off. So it kind of goes off in a way that I don't really anticipate. And I don't know if that's just typical for these guys or if this is a one-time experience with it.
Well, without getting too far ahead, we do have other samples that we can cover in our next episode.
Yes.
I am going to say the trigger on this rifle seems to be slightly unusual.
Yeah.
Which is odd because this gun is matched in its extremely good condition, although it was one that was, ground and given away apparently.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, it's clean, it's nice, it's smooth enough.
Oh, yeah.
However, I agree with Mae. There's something odd about the trigger engagement of this particular rifle. And I think we saw that on target. Don't get me wrong, it's a heavy gun. Mm-hmm. You're shooting standing, which is something that isn't standard for that time. Being the long rifle, you're not really expected to just stand in a field and point it like we do. It's all for demonstration purposes. But when we looked at your paper, that is pretty wide grouping.
It was a wide grouping. And not again to get ahead of ourselves, but we did shoot other things that day. Arguably, I would say one in far worse condition. And my grouping with that was pretty decent. Like, it was actually a really solid grouping. So I know for a fact that there's something a bit odd about this guy. Maybe it was the trigger that was causing me maybe that's what was causing some sort of wobbliness to me that day itself. But I can't exactly explain that grouping. That was a bit strange.
How do you feel about the cock on close action?
Well, it doesn't really feel all that remarkable. Oh, no, wait, that's right. I forgot. It actually is pretty strong. Dang, I didn't remember that.
Yeah, well, when you're whipping cartridges in and out of it, you don't really pay much attention to it. But
no, I'm kind of letting adrenaline carry me with it. And you're not wrong, though. This one does feel a little bit stronger than normal.
Extremely stiff. So Lee Enfield's a cock on close.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like that.
No, what's up with that? Do they just have a massive spring in here for some reason?
It's a very aggressive spring.
Okay.
And then safety?
Safety's not bad. I like the knurling on it. That right there. It's honestly, it's kind of pretty.
I will say, just from my personal observation, Argentine 1891s are very common in the American collector's market, and they have been beat on, usually. Mm-hmm. And so it has been extremely common for me to find them with safeties that just won't engage.
Really?
Because the play between the sear and the cocking piece has just walked out to the point that you can no longer get the blade of the safety to rotate in front of the cocking piece. So you either have to relieve the top face of the cocking piece in order to let that safety turn in there, or you have to find a way to build it up so that it engages the sear a little bit further out. Mm-hmm. But it is a very common thing that I've seen for these guns. I don't know why. It's just
I'm surprised you're not saying that this is something you're not finding on them, which is this little handguard up here. To me, I understand it actually is strong and solidly in there, but it kind of looks like it shouldn't be. It does look like it's fragile.
The copper wire is a very unique feature of this gun. I almost never see them without their handguards, especially like these guys with the 2 wires.
Yeah.
And then I just don't think it was a problem. Actually, I kind of wonder how much the copper wire was the right way to go, because there's all sorts of spring clip handguards that go missing.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
I mean, especially, Dutch Mannlichers. I think the importers basically just tore them off because they were getting damaged so much.
Right.
And so spring clip handguards are not my favorite. Mm-hmm. Weirdly, I have just not found a single problem with these copper wire wraps. Mm-hmm. I'm not even sure why they weren't used by others, like what became the problem with them. I don't know if they provide too much yoke on the barrel or some weird behavior that I don't know about. Mm-hmm. I kind of like them. I
mean, for the reasons I guess that they decided to choose them, don't know, but for whatever reason, it works. They held, apparently.
They seem eminently serviceable. I mean, it's the kind of thing that even if it somehow managed to break in the field, you could just fix it with some string for a little while until you got where you could get some wire.
Right.
I don't know. To me, that seems fairly smart. Now, the problem is having to take it off for cleaning, and maybe that is where it became an issue, is that they want to be able to clean for moisture under there and rot on the barrel. And so in order to do that with those, you're going to have to unbind that wire and reset it every time, which is going to be a nightmare. I
guess the only thing that otherwise is just kind of notable is just the rear sight. I was just now looking at this ladder rear sight. It kind of feels ancient. I'm
not a fan of ladders.
Yeah, me neither.
They had their place, but they seem to be fairly fragile.
Yeah. And this is a 2-button one, so not even a single button.
Well, that's the updated ladder. In this episode, we had access to, thanks to a loaner. Hold on, I've got other...
Trying to find it on the fly.
I have a lot of 1891s right now. This one is one that was used by the Spanish. So what's curious is that gun has the old pattern cocking shroud. It has the old pattern magazine release without the lock.
Okay.
It's got the old pattern handguard. But it's got the updated Spitzer sights.
Right.
And then this one, since Spain got a hold of it and they never updated the Spitzer sights on their 1891s, they were all taken during the American-Spanish War.
Okay.
Wait, what did I just call it?
American-Spanish War is what you said.
Spanish-American War.
Good
It
job.
doesn't really matter, but most people know it as a Span Am.
Okay.
So these guys never got updated by Spain. We ended up with them. And they are the original pre-Spitzer rear sights. It's how you mostly encounter them. And they work just like a 7184s. They got the flip-up blade. They got the single push button here.
Okay.
It's a lot like the Ottoman. The Ottoman's the same way.
Yeah.
But curiously, the Spanish took out of a later contract, not the original, so it does have the locking magazine, even though it's got the original sight, because that's a much later change.
Sure. So updated in some way, but not really.
Right, and then this one still doesn't have the little extra flanges on the cocking shroud.
Yeah.
So it's just odd how many things have sort of wandered in piece by piece in these rifle services. So a later pattern, which we saw photos of, because we have one here, but I didn't actually pull the gun out, was this guy. This actually belongs to our animator, Bruno.
Yeah.
And so this guy's full 8 pattern. He's got a Spitzer style updated sight like that one. It's also got the protective wings on the cocking shroud. We've got our lock screw. We've got the full length handguard.
Yes, I see.
Do you like that better by chance? I mean, you didn't get to shoot this one. Not that it would have made much of a difference.
Really. Here, hold that one for a second. I mean, there's definitely more room to grab, and I guess if I had a bayonet attachment, that would definitely come in more handy. I could see that.
This also has a soft steel cleaning rod head instead of brass.
Because I would notice. Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
It marred less easily.
That's fair. I think just in terms of usability, the extra wood wouldn't add that much extra weight, so I'd probably be like, yeah, sure, just go ahead. Like, what is it adding? 0.05 pounds? I don't know.
You also have better eye protection with that because of those flanges on the cocking shroud.
Oh,
and it's a little bit better about not wobbling on you when you're trying to bolt it shut, but not really a major issue that I know of.
That's fair.
The one thing is that none of the guns I have the original bolt. I luckily have the Ottoman 1890 here, so we were able to show you guys what that looks like. But this was almost universally
right, and
updated.
that's got the extractor in a different spot, right?
Yeah, they moved the extractor over towards the lug and then cut the lug down so that they could have that pin to keep pressure on the extractor.
Okay.
So that it wouldn't snap over on difficult extraction, which was a big deal. They were having lots of problems with the extractor. That managed to get the gun going long enough for them to ride out until the 1909 adoption.
Okay.
But yeah, there's even a modification of the receiver. We showed it better in the episode. But there is like a pin set into the receiver to support that.
Fair. And then the only other thing that I really remember all that with the shoot here, I'm take back my 1891 long boy. Was that recoil was still pretty moderate. I thought the extra added weight of the barrel would kind of help bring it down.
Pretty moderate.
Well, that's the thing.
It was extremely moderate.
It was moderate. It was solid moderate recoil, and I wasn't expecting it to be that much considering the weight of the gun. I thought it was going to bring it down, not cause a lot of climb with it. No, there was still a fair bit of oomph to it back in the shoulder and also climb to the rifle itself.
Well, don't forget 7.65. This is actually kind of interesting. 7.65 in America is often called 7.65 Argentine because there's many, many, many more of these than there are Belgian 1889s in the American collecting market. However, when we did the Belgian episode, we kind of moved everything back to 7.65 Belgian or 7.65 Mauser, which is the chambering and dimensions of the Argentine cartridge. However, they selected the German powder, which gave them a faster moving bullet slightly.
Right.
And so the Argentine bullet is a little bit more of a screamer than the Belgian, not by much, but they could get away with it. They also had selected for extremely good barrel steel. So it's fun to think about, but this is probably the most financially accessible Mauser in the American collector market. Like,
fancy.
1891 Argentines are everywhere, and a lot of them have been sporterized for deer guns and things like that. When I found out about the quality of the steel, where it's very high quality, fairly elastic with the right hardness to last for many, many rounds, you often find these with pristine bores, despite their age, despite any wear on the outside. They're usually great shooters. That made me realize how much of sort of a savings this gun is. It's underappreciated in the market, so I'll get blamed for the prices on these going up now.
Oh, I'm sure. At this point, yeah.
But they are actually quite wonderful, beautiful guns that managed to get spread around a fairly wide swath in South America. So, I don't know. I feel like I feel like they are underappreciated in the market.
That's fair.
Because they're not a great war rifle, because they're not what people think of as a hot combat rifle.
So that's your version of what I think of the Concarneau then. Where I think the Concarneau is underrated and it just tends to just shoot no matter what condition it's in.
Well, I want to go, the Concarneau will shoot in many conditions. It won't feed reliably necessarily every time.
That's fine.
It is extremely light, though. I mean, I would rather carry one.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It is a bit of a long, old world repeater, and I think we forget that. 1891 makes this a fairly early smokeless rifle, and yet I think it got a lot of things right. So overall, if you think about sort of what we've shot around this gun, would you prefer something like this or the Mosin 1891?
I'm guessing you picked the Mosin just because of the year, since they're right there with each other, but I do not see how, and I love Mosins, by the way. I'm going to say this. I love Mosins. I don't see how I would actually pick the Mosin over this guy.
No, not for a fight.
No.
The Mosin's an entertaining gun.
Oh, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I love it. It's entertaining. Makes a loud boom. It's really clicky-clacky and rackety. That's kind of its thing.
Right. No. A rimless round, fairly decent gas system. The stripper clip support and feed seems to be a lot faster than the Mosins.
Yep. And like you said, the metal with the barrel is excellent.
They're both ladder rear sights. A lot of people really think of the Mosin with its Spitzer sights, the Colin Webster. It's like banana.
Wow, that was awesome.
Yeah. But even so, honestly, I find this Spitzer sight to be more usable than the Mosin's curved one that was forced onto the base. I would definitely put the Argentine above the Russian Mosin.
Yeah.
And that's same year rifles. Now, they had different design goals, but they largely did some things the same, especially the way the magazines feed. They're very similar.
Right.
But this one ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
hands down.
The comparison for Argentina was that they were offered the long Lee Metford. Would you choose? Yes. So they chose this over the long Lee Metford. Which in its original form, I don't know if they were going with the 8 or 10 round version at that point. I'd have to look at the dates now that I think about it. But you are talking about detachable box magazine. 2 magazines would have been the plan, although that's very expensive. I don't know that Argentina would have ever done that.
I mean, ideally, the Metford sounds better. I mean,
I would pick this.
Why?
The way the barrel's bedded, I think. Now, I know on paper...
you think that just long-term use, that's...
Struggling with that trigger on paper, I don't hold that to be... Like, we're just demoing the rifle. If I sat down and shot this, I have a firm belief that dialed in, this gun is going to do better. Because the British did struggle with those long Lees, and they ultimately ended up doing a lot of things to sort of help them along.
A lot of things.
I'm going to get yelled at by the British guys that love this stuff and will defend everything they do, but there is a level to which those guns had to be tinkered inside and out over and over and over again. And this just ended up with some gas checks and things. You don't see them rebedding the barrels or changing the way they're dealing with the barrel harmonics, like the dampeners that were added to leads and things like that. So I don't know. This feels more like a solid product out of the gate.
That's fair.
It is long, but so are the long Lees.
It's not, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect, but just for a general rifle that's running and running well, boom, that's fine. Like, it's already fine as is. They didn't even really necessarily need to make any further changes.
For early smokeless, that's a high goal. I know it sounds silly, but when you set the mold, then you get kind of boring. Your middle line,
right? But
it's kind of like a Honda product. The Mausers are kind of Hondas in a way that way. But I mean, think it Gewehr 88. No way.
Yeah.
Way more problems than this.
Yeah.
The Belgian and the Ottoman are just downgrades of this because this is an upgrade of those. Great.
Right.
This doesn't get skunked until the Mauser 93, I think. But everything else around it, I mean, the Lebel was a kludge anyway, but the Lebel's not going to compare.
No.
And then even some things that sort of turn up right after this, like the Berthier's.
Oh, that's what I was literally thinking, was a Berthier, and I was like, oh, God, I wouldn't want a Berthier over that.
No. So I think for a moment, this was the king of the heap, and it really was only beat out by further refinements of itself that resulted in the Mauser 93. You basically see this progression from Mauser, where he's mastering the rifle, unlike the British, where they had to keep it internal and keep reworking it internally and re-releasing internally and pulling stuff back and pushing stuff out. Mauser in Germany had this luxury of being able to sell this iteration, and then in having additional requests from all over the world, they could blend these requests and problems in and then build the next iteration, and then push these out. And then even as these are getting out the door, you're having extraction problems. So they're going, let's do another iteration, and that's not going to work because nobody likes that. So we'll do another iteration. And then simplifying the magazine was another iteration. And, you know, we're going to get to talk. We already have an 1893 episode.
Right.
We're going to get to the 1895s, which is a slight iteration over that. But it really is that Mauser, instead of having to do it in-house, got to do it by spreading it around the world. And Argentina represents a pretty strong stepping stone that is much more accessible to people at home than the Belgian or the Ottoman examples.
Well, that's kind of cool to know. That at least this is something that if you wanted that experience, it's pretty readily available.
It's much more available.
We don't have any. We're talking about.
Yeah. Also, everybody tell Peru to make more ammo. That's the really big thing. Is keep the ammo coming.
Oh yeah.
So I
think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is there anything else about it that really stands out?
Nothing exceptionally remarkable. I still wish we could have pinpointed exactly what happened with the target impact shots. That's the one thing that's still kind of bothering me as a shooter, especially considering the rest of the things I had handled that day perfectly fine.
You know, if I thought we were going to have any issues, I would have just brought Bruno's along.
I know. So we could have at least done a comparison. We're not bright.
Yeah. So I think we're just going to wrap this one out.
Okay.
We did have a loaner on that Spanish Mauser, but he wished to remain anonymous.
Okay. Anonymous loaner. Thank you.
We do not have a dedicated executive producer for this episode.
That's true. Also, Bruno lent us this guy.
Yeah. So thank you, Bruno.
Yes.
And I believe that's actually about it. You know, the funny thing about the Argentines is they were so accessible that I just sort of slowly accumulated them for this episode. Mm-hmm. So I guess for once... Actually, I can't run down all the time because everybody the casual people that watch the show think I own everything.
Oh, God.
Yeah. But this is one
That'd
of those times
really nice.
Yeah.
This would be a nice wall if it was permanent.
This is one of those times where I found, $350. So, yes, I own that one. It's like, this is the budget I can afford. So, yeah.
Wait, that's why you've been talking about this is your budget rifle, because it was your budget rifle.
Yeah, it's I found this, and we'll see in our next episode, but I found a Peruvian for not a lot of money. So, I just was like, oh, okay, well, I guess those are done. I mean... Take me almost that much to ship them,
That's true.
So, all right.
God, with shipping.
I think that's got us wrapped up.
I think that's everything.
All right, we'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.
Thank you, everybody.
And we'll chase the front of the chambers at least enough to get them loading on a taper or something. Mm-hmm. And so I'm waiting on that, and it should be here in time for us to film for the episode that's now scheduled. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to be writing the episode as we're filming, and we're not going to know whether or not it's going to get done, and that's a really risky place to be at.
It is true.
But I have fairly high confidence in it because worst case scenario, I could check up and lathe the lead bullets to get a heel on them from this other brand, and then those would work. Mm-hmm. So I know I can get it done. I mean, there's so much scandal that can be picked apart in Colt, and you can't necessarily say whether it's true or false.
And mysteries, because there's some stuff that you're like, did he kill somebody doing this, or did they actually, or is this just a legit fire that happened by coincidence that worked in his benefit?
It is wild to think that one of the less dramatic things that Colt did was sink a ship with an undersea mine by pressing a button like a game of Battleship.
Right.
That was a calm day. And then the exciting one is, did his brother actually die in that fire?
Right.
Or did he secretly bribe everyone to keep him from being executed while also marrying him to his mistress to explain his illegitimate son?
Few months ago that the Titanfall 2 servers were doing better. And I started playing them again
playing Titanfall 2
a few weeks ago. They're doing all right. They're doing pretty good.
Don't jinx it.
The thing is, I haven't played it in a while, so I'm personally kind of sucking right now. Because
I know, you weren't even running on a wall when I looked. You were running on the ground like a peasant. I know,
like a peasant.
Yeah.
But I'm getting there.
Okay, I believe in you.
Usually by the end of the map, I've unlocked the third core, but Jesus, it used to not be that. It used to be halfway through the map. I'd at least have 10 pilot kills or something, and I'd have the third core unlocked. But no, now it's taken me near a whole map to get it done.
So you've become weak.
I have become weak.
If we look at this bolt, it is a very early 1893 style bolt in that it has the square bottomed bolt face. This was meant to try to make sure that we have maximum engagement with the cartridges, proved to be unnecessary. It also has a cut in the left side lug, and it's actually a